There is something special about the quiet before sleep. Not just the silence, but the space it opens. A space where the noise of the day begins to dissolve, and the mind floats a little lighter, a little slower. Here, this soft in between, you've found your way to Somnotales History, where every breath leads you deeper into stillness, and every story is a bridge to rest. You don't need to think, you don't need to try, just let go. Let the world drift away as we guide you into a time far from now, to a place untouched by urgency or noise, where the only rhythm is the heartbeat of the earth and the steady ring of hammer on steel. Tonight, we invite you into the life of a man not known by fame or legend, but by the quiet strength of his hands and the warmth of the fire he tended each day. A blacksmith, long ago, in a village forgotten by maps and memory. His life was simple, but never small. He rose with the sun and worked with flame, and through him, we will walk slowly through a world shaped not by kings, but by the slow forging of days. So lie back, close your eyes, the story is ready to begin. There is a kind of quiet only found in stories, a hush that wraps around you like a heavy woolen blanket on a winter's night, warm and patient. And here, at Somnotales, we invite you to sink into that stillness, a slow drift into a world far from noise, far from thought, far from anything but calm breath and gently closing eyes. The story you are about to hear is not hurried. It doesn't begin with a clamor or a clash. It begins, like all good things do, with the breath of the earth and the beat of a simple life. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of history, beyond the reach of war drums or king's orders, lies a small stone village. Its name was never written on any map. It lived through seasons, not centuries, and faded gently into time. But once, within that village, a blacksmith rose with the sun, and his life, though never told in scrolls or songs, carried the weight of the world. He was not young anymore. His back had begun to round, not from weakness, but from years bent in labor. His hands were broad, thick with muscle and callus, as though the forge had claimed them as its own. His name was Emmerich, and while others dreamed of gold or glory, Emmerich's world was simpler, bound by the hiss of steam, the glow of embers, and the steady ring of hammer on steel. This morning, like many others, Emmerich woke before the light. The coals in his hearth had died sometime in the night, leaving only a faint warmth beneath the ash. Outside, the air was cold, still heavy with mist. His home was modest, a single room with stone walls and a thatched roof, a wooden cot draped in wool, a rough-hewn table, and a small window looking east. Through it, Emmerich watched as the darkness softened into gray. He rose slowly, careful of his knees. There was no rush. There never was. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, and would do it 1,000 times again. A splash of cold water to the face, a crust of bread softened in warm goat's milk, the clink of iron keys hanging by the door, and then silence. The soft, expectant kind, like the world waiting to breathe. Emmerich stepped out into it, wrapping a thick woolen cloak over his shoulders. The village was quiet, still caught in sleep. Only the chickens murmured softly in their coops, and the frost on the grass shimmered faintly in the rising dawn. His forge stood at the far end of the path, beside the river bend. It was not a grand building, just thick stone walls, a slopped roof of dark wood, and a wide open door. But to Emmerich, it was everything. His father had built it. His father's father had worked the same anvil. This place, more than any, held memory, not in words, but in the blackened stones, in the worn tools, in the scent of fire and sweat and steel. He pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the dark greeted him like an old friend. Dust danced in the air. The forge was cold, the hearth dark, but Emmerich knew its heart still lived. It simply slept, waiting to be woken. He moved to the bellows, steady and sure, feeding them with kindling and coal, arranging the fire with practiced hands. A single spark leapt, then another, until the first threads of orange began to weave through the black. The forge breathed again. As the fire grew, so did the light, spilling softly across the tools on the wall. Hammers of different sizes, tongs, chisels, molds. Each one had a place, each one a purpose. Emmerich ran his hand over the worn wood of the workbench, the grains smoothed by years of use. Today's work was already known to him. A wheel rim for the tanner's cart, 2 new hinges for the chapel door, and a personal piece of small iron bird, delicate and curved, for the healer's daughter, who had once given him honey cakes when he had nothing left to eat. He began with the rim. The metal bar was long and cold, but he carried it with ease. Into the flames it went, slowly turning red, then orange, then white hot. The glow of it painted the walls with flickers of firelight. He took the hammer old, but balanced, and placed the bar on the anvil. Then came the sound, the first strike of the day. A deep, solid ring. There was something timeless in that sound. Something steady, as though each strike anchored the world a little more firmly. Emmerich didn't think much when he worked. His mind quieted, letting his hands lead. Blow after blow, the metal took shape, bending, stretching, curving with each strike, until the circle was formed. He quenched it in the barrel beside the forge, steam hissing upward, wrapping briefly around his face, before vanishing into the morning. He continued on, slowly, methodically. The hinges came next, smaller work, but no less important. He filed the edges with care, making sure the movement would be smooth, the joints even. When he finished, he laid them gently on the wooden shelf near the door, where the priest would find them by noon. The bird was last. He waited until the afternoon light warmed the forge. Then he took a small bar of finer iron, thin and pure, and placed it carefully into the fire. He worked it slowly, with a gentler hand, shaping the wings, the beak, the tiny tail feathers. It was no bigger than his palm, but it took longer than the wheel and hinges combined. Because in this, he poured not just skill but memory. It reminded him of his sister, long gone, who used to sit by the window and draw birds into the wood with the carving knife. He'd found one of her carvings years ago, tucked behind a beam. He never moved it. The bird cooled slowly. When he finished, he held it in both hands, the metal warm against his skin. It wasn't perfect. The tail dipped a little. The eye was slightly too high, but it had something else. Life. He wrapped it in a square of linen and placed it on the shelf with the others. Outside, the sun had already begun to set, dipping low behind the trees. The sky was painted in quiet oranges and soft golds. Emmerich stepped outside and leaned against the doorframe, watching as the village stirred again. Children calling for supper, carts rumbling slowly over the path, the smell of stew curling through the air. He didn't speak to anyone that evening. He rarely did, but as he walked back to his home, the warmth of the forge still in his bones, he felt no loneliness, just peace. The world was quiet again, and in that quiet, he rested. By the time Emmerich stepped into his home, the light had turned to a deep golden hue, the kind that lingers just a moment longer on stone walls and wooden beams before retreating fully into dusk. The fire he had lit that morning had long since faded to embers, but there was still a comforting scent in the room, something between burnt wood and warmed wool. He closed the door behind him gently, as though trying not to disturb the air itself. He sat down beside the hearth, stretched his legs out in front of him, and leaned back in the old wooden chair that had belonged to his father. Its legs creaked softly beneath his weight, but it held firm as it always did. On a small shelf above the fireplace rested a simple cup carved from ashwood. He took it down carefully, filled it with water from a clay jug, and took slow sips, letting the coolness settle inside him. Outside, the sounds of the village were fading. The children had quieted, the animals had settled, and the last of the carts had returned from the fields. A wind moved through the trees with a long sigh, stirring the leaves in tired whispers. It was the kind of wind that didn't ask questions, only reminded the world it was still breathing. Emmerich pulled a wool blanket across his lap and sat in silence for a long while. He did not think about much, not about tomorrow, not about yesterday, only the warmth in his chest and the ache in his arms, the kind of ache that meant something had been built, shaped, earned. The iron bird he'd made that afternoon still lingered in his mind. He saw it clearly, the gentle bend of its wings, the slight twist in its tail. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and perhaps that was enough. He had made hundreds of tools, hundreds of hinges and nails and horseshoes. But every so often, when the fire felt just right and the day asked gently, he shaped something useless, something beautiful. He thought of delivering it tomorrow, perhaps with a loaf of warm bread from the baker's cart. The healer's daughter was fond of birds. He'd seen her once, years ago, feeding crumbs to a finch from the edge of the well. She'd smiled, just once, and that had been enough to remember. Emmeric's thoughts drifted like smoke rising into the rafters. Slow, wandering, unhurried. He listened to the crackle of a single log catching in the hearth, the low hoot of an owl in the distance. The floor beneath him, uneven and worn smooth with age, felt like the skin of the earth. Old, steady, dependable. He closed his eyes for a while, not to sleep, but to rest within the silence. And in that quiet space, memory returned not in words, but in feeling. He saw the hands of his father guiding his grip on a hammer for the first time, felt the fear of heat the first time he stood near open flame, heard the laughter of his brother, lost in winter long ago, echoing down the narrow hall between the forge and the yard. Memories came like drifting snow, soft, unpredictable, landing lightly without asking permission. Emmerich did not resist them. He let them settle, warm and cold all at once. Eventually, the fire dimmed further, casting long shadows across the room. He stood once more, folded the blanket over the chair, and moved to his cot. The straw mattress sighed beneath him. As he lay down, hands folded over his chest, his fingers still smelled faintly of smoke and iron. Above him, through the small window, stars began to pierce the sky. Tiny white flames scattered across black velvet. He watched them for a long time, breathing slow and deep, not searching for meaning, just watching. The forge would wait until morning, and so would the world. The morning light arrived slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the peace that had settled over the village in the dark hours. Pale gold filtered through the edge of the clouds, softening everything it touched: the moss-covered rooftops, the frost-tipped grass, the worn stone walls that lined the narrow paths. The world awoke with a hush, not a shout. Inside his cottage, Emmerich stirred beneath his woolen blanket, eyes blinking open to the gray light that peeked in through the small window above his bed. For a moment, he didn't move, lying still, listening, as if to ask the day whether it truly wished to begin. A sparrow chirped from the thatched edge of the roof, and the distant bleat of a goat rose over the morning silence. He sat up slowly, feeling the stretch of his shoulders, the old familiar tightness in his lower back. A deep breath followed, slow and full, and with it came the scent of ash and cold stone. He rubbed his palms together, the skin rough with years of fire and steel, and lowered his feet to the wooden floor, which greeted him with its usual chill. Outside, the mist still clung low to the earth, curling between fence posts and around the trunks of sleeping trees. Emmerich stood at the doorway for a few moments, pulling his cloak around his shoulders as he looked out. The world seemed to whisper this morning, not of worry, but of patience, of slow beginnings. He stepped out onto the path that led to his forge, boots crunching softly over frost-stiffened grass. The village was still quiet, though here and there thin lines of smoke began to rise from chimney tops, signs of hearths being coaxed to life. The smell of distant bread baking drifted faintly in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of damp soil. His forge stood as it always had, unchanged yet never tired. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The shadows were deep at this hour, but he moved through them easily, finding his place by instinct. He set his kindling in place, stacking thin shavings of wood and coal in a careful mound, then lit a small piece of linen tucked beneath the edge. The fire hesitated, then bloomed gently at first, then with warmth that reached toward him, an old friend stretching after sleep. The forge came alive in pieces, light flickered on the walls, tools cast long shadows, and the familiar scent of smoke wrapped around the room like memory. Emmerich began his day's work without hurry. There were no orders waiting, no urgency, only the steady rhythm of creation. He shaped small things first: nails, pins, a replacement buckle for the cobbler's satchel. His hands moved with practiced ease, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting. He thought of his sister again, the way she would hum songs while carving birds into bits of wood, or sit beneath the large sycamore near the riverbank, sketching shapes into the dirt with a stick, lost in some story only she could see. She had been younger than him by 5 winters, but wiser in some ways. She had laughed more, smiled more, seen beauty in things Emmerich only understood as tools or chores. Even now, all these years later, her voice sometimes rose in the wind, soft and sudden, like a ghost brushing past the soul. He shook the memory gently, not to push it away, but to let it rest. By midday, the forge was warm and glowing, the stones of the floor holding heat like a sleeping animal. Emmerich took a short break to sit on the bench outside, letting the winter sun kiss his face. From here, he could see the children playing near the well, their laughter bouncing between the cottages. A young boy balanced on the edge of the stone wall, arms spread wide, while another tossed pebbles into the bucket below. The healer's daughter passed by, basket in hand, cloak lined with white fur at the collar. Her steps were slow and careful, but there was a lightness in her movement, as though she listened to music no one else could hear. She offered Emmerich a small nod as she walked, and he returned it with a quiet smile. The iron bird still lay wrapped in linen inside the forge. He would give it to her before the sunset. It wasn't a gift for a reason, just a thing made with care, offered to the world without expectation. That was enough. He stood and stretched, joints clicking softly as he stepped back into the warmth of the fire. The next piece he planned to make was for himself, something he hadn't done in months. A new handle for the hammer that had begun to splinter. It was a job that would take patience, though not because it was difficult, because it mattered. This hammer had been his since the age of 17, a gift from his father, passed down with only a few words. This will outlast you, if you treat it well. The handle had cracked along the grain, just enough to be noticed when the weight shifted during a swing. It hadn't broken, but the message was clear. Time was catching up, even with tools that felt eternal. He selected a length of ash wood from the shelf in the corner, straight, solid, smooth to the touch. He trimmed it with the carving blade, working slowly, peeling the bark away to reveal the pale heart of the wood. He shaped it not to be perfect, but to be familiar, to fit his hand the way memory fits the mind, without sharpness or force. As the hours passed, the light outside changed, growing softer, then thinner, then slipping away entirely. Emmerich worked by firelight now, the flames dancing across the stone walls, casting long shadows that moved like breath. When the handle was shaped and smooth, he slid the hammerhead into place, tapping it gently, listening to the tone it gave. A low, solid ring, a sound he had heard 1,000 times, but which always felt like a promise. He turned the tool in his hand, then held it still. Outside, the village was quiet once again. He stepped out into the cool evening, the wrapped bird tucked into the crook of his arm. The healer's cottage stood at the edge of the path near the woods, a small stone house with a crooked chimney and a garden lined with winter herbs. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the roof, and soft candlelight flickered in the windows. He knocked gently. The healer, an older woman with silver hair wrapped beneath a dark cloth, opened the door with a look of quiet surprise. "Evening, Emmerich," she said, voice gentle and worn. "Is something wrong?" "No," he replied, holding out the linen-wrapped bundle. "Just something small. For Era." The woman raised a brow but accepted it without question. "She's inside, reading by the fire." "I'll give it to her," he nodded. "Tell her it doesn't fly." The healer chuckled softly. "She'll like it anyway." As he turned to leave, the door creaked closed behind him, and the night stretched out ahead, cool and silent. He walked slowly back toward his home, the sound of his boots soft against the dirt path. Stars were beginning to appear once more, scattered and distant, like memories too far away to hold but too bright to forget. The village slept lightly, its breath rising with chimney smoke and the rustle of dry leaves. And somewhere, just beyond the trees, a lone owl called into the night. Emmerich reached his cottage, stepped inside, and let the door shut behind him. He did not light a new fire. The warmth from the forge still lingered in his skin. He removed his cloak, folded it, and lay back on the cot, hands resting across his chest. Sleep did not rush to find him, it drifted down like snowfall, slow and soft, and he welcomed it with the ease of someone who had earned rest, not just taken it. And as his eyes closed, the night settled deeper around the village, holding it gently in place as if the stars themselves had chosen to watch over. A blacksmith whose life was quiet, steady, and full. The dreams came gently, if they came at all. In the warm dark of the cottage, time softened its edge. The walls of stone no longer held shape, they faded into mist. The cot beneath him felt like clouded earth, floating between thought and sleep. There was no noise, only breath. And within that breath, the night lingered long and deep. By the time Emmerich opened his eyes, the sky had shifted once again. Pale gray spread like milk poured across old parchment, and the air inside the room carried a faint chill, not sharp, but watchful. He lay still for a moment, listening to the small creaks of the cottage as it settled. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed once, as if checking whether morning had truly arrived. He rose slowly, muscles stiff but familiar. There was no need to rush. The village moved at its own pace, and so did he. He took a moment to wash his face with cool water from the basin, then pulled on his woolen tunic and tied it at the waist. The cloak waited by the door, as it always did, draped over a wooden peg like a loyal companion. He took it gently and stepped outside. The morning mist was thicker than usual. It hung low to the ground, brushing against boots and fence posts, curling between trees like curious fingers. The path to the forge seemed softer, blurred at the edges, as though the world itself was still waking. As Emmerich walked, he noticed the soft sounds of the village returning one by one, like lanterns being lit, a cartwheel turning, a door unlatching, a child's laugh, faint and sudden, from behind the baker's house. All of it folded neatly into the rhythm of another quiet day. The forge welcomed him like always, door stiff, air cool, shadows long across the stone floor. He kindled the fire with the fresh handful of dry wood, coaxing the embers with care, and watched as the first flames took root. The heat spread slowly, warming the stones, bringing color back to the gray. On the workbench lay the newly handled hammer from the day before. He turned it in his hand, feeling the balance. There was comfort in its weight, like a handshake from a friend who never needed to speak. He rested it on the anvil and stepped outside again for a moment, letting the fire breathe. From where he stood, he could see the healer's house across the path, just beyond a line of bare-limbed trees. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney, a sign of life. He wondered whether Era had seen the bird, whether she had smiled. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching on the path. Turning, he saw a familiar figure. Joran, the cooper, broad and ruddy-faced, with a beard that looked like it had never been trimmed the same way twice. "Morning, Emmerich," Joran called, lifting a hand. Emmerich nodded. "Morning." Joran approached with a slight limp, the result of a bad fall years ago that had never quite healed right. He carried a short length of broken iron hoop, bent at the middle. Barrel snapped on the south fence. "Think you could help with the new ring?" Emmerich reached out and took the hoop, inspecting it with quiet care. "By evening," he said simply. "Good man," Joran said, slapping his shoulder with a thick hand before turning back toward the road. The exchange was brief, but not empty. In villages like these, words were not used wastefully. A nod, a touch, a glance, they spoke louder than full sentences. Emmerich stepped back into the forge and began sorting through his metal stockpile. He found a strip of iron already close to the right size, and laid it near the fire to warm. As he waited, he sharpened his tools on the grindstone, foot moving the pedal in slow, steady motion. Sparks danced like fireflies against the dim light, vanishing almost as quickly as they appeared. He worked without thinking. That was the way he preferred it. Thought could become clutter. Action was cleaner. The iron began to glow, and the forge filled with the sweet, heavy scent of hot metal. He brought the strip to the anvil, hammering it slowly, reshaping the bend with measured strikes. Each ring of metal echoed through the forge like a soft bell, not jarring, but steady like the ticking of some old, invisible clock. Hours passed, unnoticed. The light outside shifted as the sun climbed behind a veil of clouds. Rain threatened on the horizon, not loud storm rain, but the kind that falls gently for hours, soaking the earth without drama. Emmerich welcomed it. Rain cooled the forge's outer walls and softened the air inside. As the ring took its shape, he paused briefly to sip from a wooden cup. The water was slightly cool, drawn from the well that morning. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly, and the world had turned a pale silver. A group of travelers moved along the distant road, 3 figures on foot, 1 mule in tow. They passed quietly, without turning, cloaked against the wind. The village did not get many visitors, and when it did, they did not stay long. By early afternoon, the ring was finished. Emmerich cooled it, wiped it clean, and wrapped it in cloth before placing it on the shelf near the forge's entrance. He sat on the bench again, stretching his legs, rubbing the ache from his fingers. A pair of birds flitted in the tree above, wings sharp against the dull sky. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind moving through the leaves, the soft creak of the forge's door swinging slightly on its hinges. In the calm of the moment, his thoughts drifted again back to younger days, when his father was still alive, and the forge rang louder, busier. There had been apprentices once. Not many, but enough. Boys who came with wide eyes and eager hands. Most moved on. One stayed for years. Thomas. Emmerich remembered him well. Strong arms, steady heart, curious mind. He had been like a younger brother, though they never spoke of it that way. Thomas had left one spring morning, walking west with nothing but a pack and a promise to return. He never had. Some said he'd found work in a larger town. Others whispered he'd joined the king's soldiers. Emmerich never asked. He simply waited for a time, and then stopped waiting. Loss in a village like this didn't shout. It didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in quietly, like moss on stone, and stayed. A drop of rain touched his hand, then another on the bridge of his nose. He opened his eyes to find the sky now darker, the clouds thick and low. Rain began in earnest, a soft, steady drizzle that softened the world. He stood and stepped back into the forge, closing the door behind him. Inside, the air was warm, the fire low but steady. He added a few coals, then took a seat near the hearth, letting the sounds of rain fill the room. It tapped on the roof like fingers drumming lightly. No rhythm, no demand, just presence. He took a small strip of copper and began shaping it into a spiral. It had no purpose. It wasn't for anyone. Just a piece of thought given shape. His hands moved slowly, gently, folding metal like a lullaby. As the rain deepened, the forge dimmed. Outside, the village blurred beneath the curtain of water. Windows glowed like stars behind streaked glass. The scent of baking bread floated faintly through the cracks, mixed with wet earth and smoke, and in that quiet, Emmerich found rest, not sleep, but stillness. A space between moments where nothing needed to happen. He leaned back against the wall, letting his eyes half close, the copper spiral resting warm in his palm. The storm would pass. The fire would dim. The world would go on turning. But here, in the forge, there was only warmth, and breath, and peace. The rain had continued through most of the night, tapping against the roof of Emmerich's cottage in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The sound of it had merged with the quiet breath of sleep, forming a gentle music that wrapped around the hours. By the time morning arrived, the rain had softened into mist again, fine and silvery, clinging to branches and window panes like a memory that refused to leave. Emmerich awoke slowly. His dreams had been shapeless, drifting thoughts more than stories, but not unsettling. He felt rested in a way he hadn't noticed the day before. His bones still ached, yes, but less like burden and more like reminder. A quiet acknowledgement of work done. He stood and stretched, letting his arms rise toward the low beams of the ceiling, joints quietly protesting. Outside the window, the world remained still, the sky a soft gray, leaves heavy with water. He moved, without speaking, washing his face, adjusting the simple belt at his waist, wrapping his cloak against the damp air. The coals in the hearth had gone cold. He didn't relight them. Today didn't seem to require fire yet. The walk to the forge was slower than usual, not because of pain or weariness, but because the village itself seemed to move more slowly. Puddles lined the path, reflecting patches of sky, and each footstep made a soft splash. Moss glistened on the stone walls. Water dripped in quiet intervals from the thatched edges of rooftops. He passed by the baker's house, the scent of rye bread faint but familiar. The baker herself, a short woman with sleeves rolled high and flour dusted into the creases of her face, stood just outside, brushing crumbs from a tray. "Morning, Emmerich," she said with a nod, not pausing her work. "Morning," he replied, with the softest curl of his lips. "You'll need bread today?" He thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll leave a loaf at your door," she said. "The dark one. Your favorite." He gave another nod. That was enough. The forge was dark when he arrived, but still warm. The fire hadn't burned overnight, but the stone still held some of yesterday's heat, clinging to the air like a distant memory. He opened the shutters first, letting in what little light the clouded sky offered. Then, without much thought, he moved toward the hearth and began the familiar process of building flame. As the kindling caught and the coals deepened into orange glow, Emmerich turned toward his bench. Today's work wasn't yet planned. No one had left requests. No one had come with a broken latch or a worn blade. The village, like the sky, seemed to ask only for quiet. So he began on a piece of his own. In the corner of the forge sat a small bundle of old tools, worn down to near uselessness: short-handled hammers with split grips, rust-flecked tongs, a file to dull to smooth even the softest edge. He'd been meaning to sort through them, to discard what was beyond saving, and perhaps salvage what could be restored. He sat on the floor beside them, sorting each by touch more than sight. The wood of the handles told stories smoothed by years of sweat, marred by scars from heat and time. The iron tips, dulled by overuse, seemed to whisper their fatigue. One by one, he placed them into piles. Keep, reshape, retire. As he worked, a soft knock came at the forge's door. He rose, dusted his hands on his apron, and stepped across the stone floor. Standing just outside was a boy no more than 10 winters, with a mop of damp, dark hair and wide eyes. He clutched something to his chest wrapped in cloth, and looked up without speaking. Emmerich opened the door fully and waited. "My mum says it's bent," the boy said, holding out the bundle. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small metal pan, the sort used to catch dripping wax from a candle, bent at one edge. It was simple work, a few taps, a little heat, nothing difficult. Emmerich nodded once and motioned for the boy to wait near the door. He crossed the forge, slipped the pan into the heat just long enough to soften its memory, then laid it across the anvil and pressed the edge gently back into shape. The metal gave easily. No sharp strikes needed, only patience. Within minutes, the piece was as it should be. He returned it silently, wrapped again in the same cloth. The boy blinked, then reached into a small pouch tied at his waist and held out 2 small coins smoothed from age and rubbed nearly blank. Emmerich shook his head. The boy hesitated, then nodded, and turned to leave without another word. The boy hesitated, then nodded, and turned to leave without another word. It was how things worked in the village. Sometimes payment came in coin, sometimes in bread or wool or a bit of fresh fish, and sometimes it came in the quiet joy of a child returning home with a task fulfilled. The forge returned to silence. Emmerich finished sorting the tools, setting aside a single chisel whose blade had worn almost to nothing. He placed it on the shelf beside the copper spiral, and sure why he didn't discard it. There was something in its shape he liked, a reminder, perhaps, that even worn things had their place. The hours passed gently, measured only by the movement of shadows across the floor and the steady soft breaths of the fire. He made a latch for no door, a hinge for no gate, a handle for no blade. Simple shapes, formed more for motion than need. His hands knew how to stay busy. His mind floated just above. In the late afternoon, quiet knock came again. This time, it was the healer's daughter Era, standing with her cloak pulled close, a faint smile warming her face. "I came to thank you," she said. "The bird was beautiful." Emmerich didn't speak, only nodded. his gaze resting for a moment on the ground, then drifting back to her eyes. "I've never seen something so small feel so alive," she added. "It wasn't meant to fly," he said quietly. She smiled wider. "But it does, somehow." They stood for a moment in a shared pause. The forge crackled behind him. Rain still drizzled against the roof. "I'll leave you to your work," she said at last, stepping back. Before she turned, she placed something on the edge of the doorway, a bundle of herbs tied with string. Lavender, a hint of mint, and something else he didn't recognize, sharp but calming. "For your sleep," she said. "It helps the mind settle." He nodded again. She turned and disappeared down the path, her boots whispering against the damp earth. He picked up the herbs and held them to his nose. The scent was light, fresh. It reminded him of his sister's hair when she came in from the garden in spring. That evening, after the fire had dimmed and the tools were cleaned and set aside, Emmerich sat by the hearth in his cottage with the herbs tied above his bed. He drank a simple tea, laced with a few of the leaves, and sat quietly in the fading light. His body was tired, but gently so. When he lay down, the scent still hung in the air, subtle and clean, curling through the dark like a river winding slowly through stone. And as his breath slowed, and the stars gathered outside the window, Emmerich let go of the day, not forcefully, not with urgency, but like setting down a tool after long use, knowing it would be there in the morning, exactly as it should be. And with that, the blacksmith slept. The night passed without sound, save for the occasional sigh of wind against the cottage walls. Emmerich slept deeply, untouched by dreams, wrapped in the soft warmth of stillness. The scent of lavender drifted gently above him, mingling with the faint memory of firewood and iron, soothing the corners of his mind that usually stayed alert, even in rest. When he awoke, light was already brushing against the edge of the windowpane, pale, cold sunlight that belonged more to winter than to spring. The world outside remained quiet. No roosters crowed, no carts rattled down the path, just silence, full, not empty like a held breath before song. He sat up slowly, the warmth of the blankets lingering across his chest. The air in the room was cool, but not unfriendly, just honest. He placed his feet on the wooden floor and paused, listening. Somewhere, a crow cawed in the distance, its voice sharp against the silence, then gone. He moved without hurry, dressing in layers, wrapping his cloak snug against his shoulders. He didn't light the hearth today. The cold wasn't deep enough to demand flame, and the cottage held enough warmth from the day before to carry him. Outside, the path glistened with dew. The puddles from yesterday's rain had thinned, and the sky above had begun to clear, patches of soft blue peeking through the silver clouds. It felt like a day between days, not a beginning or an end, but something suspended in the middle. The forge, the coals had cooled completely. Emmerich opened the door and stood for a moment, letting the morning air move through the space. It smelled of damp stone and resting metal, the kind of smell only time could make. He set about lighting the fire again, stacking the wood with practiced ease, coaxing the flame gently into being. When it finally caught and began to grow, he didn't rush into work. Instead, he sat near the door, sharpening a small knife that belonged to no one in particular, just a simple, curved blade with a handle worn smooth by years of use. It was while he worked that the letter arrived. A boy no older than 12 approached, thin, long-legged, with a red scarf and a nervous expression. He held the folded paper with both hands, careful not to crumple the edges. When Emmerich looked up, the boy only offered the envelope and mumbled, "From the town." Before retreating the way he came, Emmerich turned the letter over in his hands. It bore no seal, no official crest, just his name written plainly in a slow, careful hand. He hadn't received a letter in years. He set the knife aside and opened it. The writing inside was neat but slightly uneven, as though written by someone unused to long correspondence. The words were brief but clear. "Emmerich, I heard you were still in the village. I wasn't sure you'd stayed. If this reaches you, I would like to visit. It's been long enough. There's something I need to say, not for the past, but for whatever time remains." Tomas, the name settled in his chest like a stone in water. Tomas, the apprentice who had once worked beside him, who had laughed at his own mistakes, who had stayed late to finish a bent blade just right, who had vanished one spring morning with only a nod and a pack on his back. That was 13 winters ago. Emmerich stared at the letter for a long while, then folded it slowly and set it beside the copper spiral. He did not smile. He did not frown. He only breathed once deeply. He stood and returned to his workbench. The knife still lay waiting, half sharpened. He took it up again and resumed the soft, steady movement across the whetstone. The rhythm calmed him. Steel against stone. Over and over. The sound of repetition, of return. The hours passed as they always did. Quiet, unremarkable. He finished the knife, began shaping a pair of hinges, reheated a cracked plowshare that had waited too long to be mended. But through it all, the letter remained near, like a thread gently tugging at the edge of his thoughts. By late afternoon, he stepped out into the pale sunlight and walked the length of the village, just to feel the air and see the faces of those he had lived among for so long. The cobbler waved from his stool. The baker's daughter ran past with the ribbon trailing behind her. The old shepherd dozed beneath the same tree he always had, one boot off, one on, a soft snore escaping now and then. Emmerich moved quietly, hands tucked into his sleeves. He passed the healer's house again. The garden had begun to wake after the rain, small green shoots rising from the softened soil. A cat dozed on the stone step. From inside came the soft sound of humming Ira's voice, distant but calm, like water over pebbles. He didn't stop, only listened. By the time he returned to the forge, the sun had begun its descent. He sat once more by the fire, which now burned low and warm, and held the letter again. His thumb traced the creases of the paper. Thomas. So much time between words. So many things left unsaid. He didn't know what he would say when the man arrived. If he arrived. The letter had been careful, not a promise, but a possibility. And still, it stirred something inside him. Not hope. Not. The days that followed passed like falling leaves, slow, silent, each one almost indistinguishable from the last. The sun rose behind the same clouds, casting its light gently across the stones of the village. The forge glowed softly in the early hours, breathed through the afternoon, and dimmed again by dusk. No one asked Emmerich about the letter. No one knew. And yet, the stillness around him seemed to shift, just slightly, as though the world sensed something waiting on the wind. Emmerich kept to his rhythm. He repaired the latch on the schoolhouse door, which had stuck every winter since the last frost, cracked the frame. He mended a broken hinge for the widow Marlin's gate, and straightened a bent poker that the innkeeper's youngest son had used to chase off a goose. Each task was simple, each one familiar, but his mind was quieter now, as if conserving some private energy, storing it like embers in the back of the hearth. He hadn't spoken Tomas's name aloud, but it hovered in his thoughts like dust in the forge light, never settling, never vanishing. Not painful, exactly, just present. One afternoon, with no orders left and the forge unusually quiet, Emmerich wandered outside and stood beneath the old chestnut tree that marked the center of the village. Its wide branches had not yet begun to bud, but its bark still bore the faint markings of initials carved long ago by hands now gone. He traced one faint line with his thumb, faded letters, once fresh, now softened by time and rain. Children ran past, chasing a rag-stuffed ball, with shouts that rang against the stone. He watched them for a moment, remembering when he too had run, barefoot and laughing, across these same paths before the forge, before the weight of steel, before the years settled around his shoulders like a well-worn cloak. At the edge of the village, the road stretched toward the hills, winding between the trees and out of sight. He stood there for a long while, watching the wind stir the grasses, expecting nothing, but ready. That evening, as he sat in the low glow of his cottage, sipping warm tea steeped with dried mint and lavender, he heard it, the soft rhythm of footsteps approaching the door. Not hurried, not uncertain, just steps. Tired, maybe, but steady. He rose and opened the door. Tomas stood on the threshold. Older, yes. His hair streaked with gray now, beard fuller, frame broader but unmistakable. The same eyes, though slightly dimmed by the years, the same way he tilted his head slightly to the left when uncertain, a habit Emmerich had noticed long ago but never mentioned. Neither spoke at first, then Tomas gave a slow nod. You kept the forge. Emmerich stepped aside. It kept me. Tomas entered, shedding his cloak and placing it near the door. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting long shadows against the walls. Emmerich poured a second cup of tea and handed it over. The silence between them was not awkward. It was full like a well after rain. They sat by the fire, steam rising from the cups in their hands. I almost didn't write, Tomas said after a long while. I know. I didn't know if you'd still be here. I never left. Tomas nodded, as though that explained everything. And perhaps it did. I've seen a dozen cities, he said, gaze distant. Held a sword, stood on castle walls, shoed horses that were bound for battle. But I never slept as well as I did here. Emmerich said nothing, only listened. I thought I needed to leave, Tomas continued, his voice low, to find something bigger, something louder. But the farther I went, the more I missed the quiet. The fire shifted, a log settling deeper into its bed of coals. I remembered your patience, Tomas said, glancing sideways. The way you waited for metal to speak before you struck. I never found that kind of stillness again. They sat like that for a long time, two men older than they remembered being, warmed not just by fire, but by something that had not yet turned to ash. Tomas stayed the night in the extra cot that had belonged to Emmerich's father. In the morning, he joined Emmerich at the forge, not as a guest, but as someone who remembered the weight of the hammer, the sound of tongues biting steel, the rhythm of shaping something that would last. They didn't speak much as they worked. They didn't need to. Emmerich guided him gently, as if no time had passed. Tomas's hands remembered more than his mind did. Muscle, not memory, led the way. By noon, they had reshaped a broken scythe and begun fashioning a new gate hinge. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in days. Birds moved through the trees, calling to each other in tones only they could understand. The village children stopped at the open door of the forge, watching the two men work, the clang of metal somehow softer now, not sharp, but rhythmic, like a lullaby struck in iron. The days that followed passed the same way. Tomas stayed in the cottage, mended what needed mending, spoke little, and listened more. He brought news from other places, of cities crowded with markets and banners, of stone towers rising like teeth against the horizon, of ships at the sea's edge, waiting for wind. But he never spoke of war or loss or what had taken him so long to return. And Emmerich never asked. Some evenings, they walked through the village paths together, past the well, past the bakers, past the field where wildflowers would bloom come spring. Sometimes they spoke of small things, the way the stars had shifted since last summer, the strange shape of a root pulled from the garden, a dog that barked only at the moon. Other nights, they sat in silence, drinking tea, listening to the fire. It was on one of those evenings that Tomas finally said, I'm not here to stay. Emmerich nodded once. I can't. I don't know why. I wish I could. But I'm just passing through. That's all right, Emmerich said, his voice quiet. You're not angry? No, Tomas looked at the flames. I just needed to see that this place was still here, that you were still here. Emmerich looked into his cup, then back at Tomas. Sometimes, it's enough to return, even if you don't stay. They clinked cups in a quiet toast, the sound barely louder than breath. When Tomas left a week later, he didn't leave a note, only a small bundle of tools on the workbench, old ones, reshaped and cleaned. Handles were wrapped in fresh leather. Emmerich found them the next morning, placed them on the shelf beside the copper spiral, and said nothing. The forge burned quietly, the road remained open, and life continued. Soft, steady, and full of breath. The days that followed moved quietly, like threads pulled slowly through cloth. The sun rose earlier now, climbing gently over the edge of the hills, casting long fingers of light across the damp grass and stone. Spring had not yet fully arrived, but it had begun to whisper in the thaw of the soil, the swell of unopened buds, the way the birds called earlier in the day. Tomas was gone, but his presence lingered in the corners of the forge. Not loud, Not ghost-like, but real. Emmerich found himself reaching for one of the clean tools Tomas had left behind, and pausing just a moment before lifting it. The leather wrapping was new, but familiar. It fit his hand as though it had waited for him. The work resumed its rhythm. The village returned to its slow routines. The forge welcomed its usual visitors, Joran, needing a gate brace. The shepherd, with a broken lantern frame. Even the schoolteacher, who asked if Emmerich could make a set of letters in metal not sharp, not large, to help the children learn by touch. He accepted the task without a word and began shaping the alphabet one letter at a time. Curve carefully rounded, each edge softened by hand. He lined them up across the workbench like a quiet procession. A tz, in iron. When he delivered them in a sack to the schoolhouse, the children gathered around, wide-eyed. The teacher laid them gently onto the floor. One of the younger boys picked up the S and traced it with his finger, as if discovering something secret and beautiful. Emmerich said nothing, but the look on his face, subtle as a breath, said everything. Later that evening, he returned to his cottage and sat by the window as the light dimmed into dusk. He didn't light the hearth. He didn't brew tea. He simply watched the sky turn from gray to rose to the deep blue of early night. A bird landed on the edge of the garden fence. Not the same kind he had shaped for Era, but something smaller, feathers fluffed, round body like a soft stone. It sang once, then flew. The next morning, as Emmerich swept the forge floor, a figure approached slowly from the path. It was Era. She held a small box wrapped in linen and smiled as she stepped into the doorway. "I brought something," she said. He set the broom aside and nodded for her to enter. She placed the box on the workbench and opened it carefully. Inside lay rows of small glass vials, each with a cork top and a handwritten label. The scent rose immediately, clean, green, faintly sweet. "I've been mixing these," she said. "Oils from plants near the river. Calming, mostly. Some for pain." He looked at them, then at her. "Thought maybe your hands hurt. Or your shoulders. You don't say when they do." He nodded once. She picked up one of the vials and uncorked it, letting a few drops fall onto a cloth. Then she reached gently for his hand, rough, weathered, marked by years of heat and weight, and began to rub the oil into his knuckles. At first, he didn't move. Then he closed his eyes. The warmth sank into his skin. Not just the warmth of the oil, but the warmth of her touch, quiet, patient, certain, like rain soaking slowly into the earth. He didn't speak, and neither did she. The forge was silent, save for the low crackle of coals and the distant sound of birdsong outside. When she finished, she wrapped the cloth and handed it to him. "You can use it at night," she said. "If they ache." He nodded again, more deeply this time. She smiled, then stepped back toward the door. "Spring's almost here," she said softly. "The snowdrops are blooming." He looked at her, the edges of his mouth lifting slightly. "I know." She left without needing to say goodbye. That night, Emmerich stood in the doorway of his cottage long after the sun had set. The stars above were sharp, clearer than they had been in weeks. He leaned against the frame and listened to the wind move through the trees, a low, steady breath that filled the quiet spaces of the night. He held the cloth in his hand, the scent of the oil rising with the warmth of his skin. Inside, the fire had been left to burn down naturally. The tools were clean, the floor swept. On the shelf, beside the copper spiral and the chisel with the worn blade, the bundle of letters still rested untouched, but never forgotten. And in the calm of that long night, Emmerich allowed himself to remember, not with regret, but with acceptance. Some things return, some things remain. Some things live only in the forge, in the hands that shape metal, in the way the morning light catches on the edge of a newly smoothed blade. He did not need to hold it all. He only needed to be present. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was dark, but not cold, and as he lay on his cot and closed his eyes, the last thing he felt was the warmth of the oil still lingering in his hands, and the gentle press of silence, like a soft blanket drawn over the day. Sleep came quickly, and without sound. The days had grown noticeably longer. The edges of the sky lingered in light, even after the sun had dipped behind the hills. Where once the evenings had arrived like a thick curtain drawn swiftly over the day, now twilight stretched like soft wool across the hours, comforting and slow. Emmerich began rising earlier, though not by choice. His body simply woke, not startled, not restless, just quietly aware of the shift in the season. He no longer needed a lamp to dress by. The light seeped in through the cracks of the shutters before the birds even stirred. It was not loud light, not bold, just enough to see by, just enough to remind him that time was moving, gently, forward. He no longer measured time in weeks, or names of days. He measured it by the color of the grass in the fields, by the weight of the wind through the forge, by the sound the morning made, and what sounds were missing. The forge had become quieter lately, not because of disuse, but because of completion. There were fewer tools to repair, fewer hinges to forge. The village, for now, was well mended. And so Emmerich found himself shaping pieces without purpose again, forms not ordered, not requested, but simply imagined. One morning, he began a small sculpture. Not a bird this time, nor a leaf. This was something abstract, though he wouldn't have used that word. It was only a shape, two arcs of iron joined at the base, opening upward like a pair of hands releasing steam. He wasn't sure why he made it, only that it felt necessary to begin. He worked slowly, often pausing for long stretches, not thinking but simply standing beside the work, as if waiting for it to decide what it wanted to become. There was no rush. The forge burned low. The tools sat patiently, and outside, the season whispered around the stone walls, softening the world. He didn't know it, but word of the sculpture spread not far, just within the village. The baker's son mentioned it to the midwife's niece, who said something to the schoolteacher's father. A quiet curiosity began to grow, not the sort that brought crowds or questions, but the kind that made people glance in the window when passing the forge, just to catch a glimpse of whatever shape was taking form. One day, Era returned, not with herbs, not with tea, but with a book, old, leather-bound, pages slightly curled at the corners. "I thought you might like this," she said, handing it over without much ceremony. He took it, thumbed through the pages. It wasn't about blacksmithing. It was poetry, verses written by someone long gone, speaking of rivers, stones, stars, silence. "I don't read much," Emmerich said softly. "No," she replied, "but I think this kind doesn't ask much of you." He nodded and placed it on the shelf, beside the copper spiral and Tomas's rewrapped tools. That night, after the forge was dark and the sky scattered with stars, he opened the book and read a single page. He didn't remember the words, but the feeling stayed like the low echo of a bell rung in the distance. Not loud, but deep. The sculpture began to take on its final shape. He curved the top arcs more sharply, added texture along the base. Not decoration exactly, but something that made it feel older than it was. He didn't name it. He didn't need to. One morning, as he stood beside it, wiping soot from his palms, a voice spoke from the doorway. "It looks like prayer." He turned. It was the widow Marlin, leaning slightly on her cane, eyes sharp despite her years. "I didn't mean it to," Emmerich said. She stepped inside, her boots making soft sounds against the stone. "Doesn't matter," she said. "Sometimes meaning finds its own shape." She touched the iron gently, fingertips brushing the curve. "Feels good," she added. "Warm, even when it's cold." He nodded. She didn't stay long, but after she left, Emmerich looked at the sculpture differently, not with pride, not with doubt, just with presence, like one regards a stone that's always been there, only now polished enough to be seen clearly. He placed it near the forge door, where light could reach it through the window, in the early afternoon, and there it stayed. People didn't ask about it, but they noticed. Some paused to look, some smiled and walked on. Some said nothing at all. That was enough. One afternoon, a small boy, the same who had once brought the bent candle pan, came again, this time with a horseshoe in hand. "It's my uncle's," he said. "He doesn't know I brought it, but it's cracked." Emmerich knelt beside him, inspecting the shoe. The crack was clean, right through the center. "I can fix it," he said. "Can I stay and watch?" Emmerich looked at the boy, dark hair, wide eyes, scuffed boots, and nodded once. The boy stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching silently as Emmerich moved through the motions, heating, striking, folding the iron back into itself. The fire hissed and flared. The shoe began to glow. The boy didn't speak the entire time. When it was done and cooled, Emmerich handed it over with both hands. "Tell your uncle it's ready." The boy hesitated, then said, "I think he's sad." Emmerich didn't ask why, only said, "Then this might help." The boy nodded once, tucked the shoe under his arm, and ran off. Later that evening, Emmerich sat by the sculpture with the book Era had given him open on his lap. He didn't read aloud, he only moved his eyes across the lines, slowly. The fire behind him crackled, casting long shadows that danced along the wall. Outside, the first frogs of the season had begun to sing low, rhythmic, deep as the belly of the earth. A kind of music only spring could bring. The sculpture caught the light just so. It gleamed faintly, and in that quiet moment, Emmerich realized that the forge had become more than it once was. It was still a place of tools and metal and heat, but also of return, of pause, of rest, of slow, wordless healing. He leaned back, letting the air settle around him. The book closed in his lap, and the night, like the forge, glowed gently on. The sculpture remained by the door, though Emmerich no longer looked at it as often. It had become a part of the forge now, like the anvil or the bellows or the worn bench he sat on during long afternoons. It didn't need to be admired, it only needed to exist, and that was enough. Spring deepened, not with sudden bursts of color, but through quiet signs. The moss along the stones thickened, the streams began to move more quickly, and the wind lost its bite, replacing chill with breath. At night, the frogs sang longer, and the stars seemed to hum a little closer. In the mornings, Emmerich noticed more footsteps outside his window, not hurried ones, not carts or hooves, but soft, hesitant steps. People passed by the forge more often, sometimes pausing, sometimes not. He never minded. The forge had always been a place of work, but lately, it had become something gentler, a place where people simply arrived and stayed for a moment longer than they had planned. He didn't speak of this change. He didn't need to. One morning, the midwife came not for a tool, but for a favor. "It's not for me," she said, her voice roughened by years but kind. "It's for a child, one of the new ones. She was born early, smaller than the others, sleeps in a bundle no bigger than a loaf of bread." Emmerich listened. "I thought maybe a char, something made by your hands. Nothing to fine, just small, for luck." He nodded. He didn't ask for payment. He worked on it that afternoon, shaping a tiny disc of iron, no wider than his thumb. On one side, he pressed a simple spiral not unlike the one on the shelf. On the other, he left it plain. He didn't polish it smooth, but left the surface slightly textured as if it had already been touched by time. When the midwife returned the next day, he handed it to her without words. She held it in both hands and studied it closely. "She'll keep this," she said softly, "even if she never knows where it came from." He only nodded. As the days passed, Emmerich began to notice more things in the quiet. The way the light through the forge window shifted just a little each day. The soft creak of the bellows when the weather turned damp. The hum of bees returning to the early blossoms near the fence. These weren't new sounds, only newly heard. One morning, he opened the forge early before the mist had fully lifted from the fields. The coals were slower to catch in the cold air, but he didn't mind. He waited beside them with his hands open, palms out, absorbing what little warmth there was. It was on that morning that Era came again. She didn't speak right away. She only stood at the door and watched the fire take shape. Then, gently, "You've changed." He turned slightly, not surprised. "How?" "You listen more," she said. "Even when no one's talking." He smiled faintly, just at the corners of his mouth. She stepped inside and looked around. "The sculpture, it feels like it's breathing. It's just iron. It's never just iron." He didn't argue. He simply returned to his workbench, where a strip of flattened steel lay waiting to be curled into something he wasn't yet sure what. "I have something," she said. He looked up. She held out a small wooden box, tied shut with a thin leather string. He took it, untied the knot, and opened the lid. Inside were 5 glass vials, each marked with a single hand-painted symbol: a wave, a flame, a leaf, a feather, and a star. For sleep, she said. And for thought. Each one is a blend. Not strong. Just enough. He studied them for a moment, then looked up. I thought of your father, she said, when I mixed the one with the flame. He always said the forge needed to smell like something alive. Emmerich remembered that, though faintly. A sentence said once in passing, long ago. It had stayed. He reached out and touched the vial with the flame symbol. That evening, as dusk pressed against the windows and the wind carried the scent of earth and ash, he placed a drop of the oil into a shallow dish by the fire. The scent rose slowly, warm, woodsy, with a note of smoke that wasn't sharp but deep, like memory. He didn't read that night. He didn't shape anything. He only sat in silence, his hands resting on his knees, eyes half-closed. It was enough. The next few days brought no visitors, and Emmerich didn't seek anyone out. He tended the forge, but lightly. He let the coals sleep longer. He walked the edges of the village path where the moss was thickest. He watched a pair of birds build a nest in the eaves above his cottage, the same kind he had once shaped from copper, though their feathers were darker and their song more varied. One night, he dreamed not of the forge, or of metal, or of work, but of water, slow-moving, clear, a stream winding through grass, smooth stones visible beneath its surface. He stood in the water, barefoot, and the current wrapped gently around his ankles. There was no fear, no urgency, only flow. When he woke, the scent of the flame oil still lingered faintly in the air. He sat up, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and stepped outside. The stars were scattered thick above the trees. No clouds, no wind, just the soft hush of early spring holding the village in its palm. In the distance, an owl called once, then again, and Emmerich, standing barefoot in the doorway, felt something loosen inside him. Not a sharp break, not a tear, just a soft untying of a knot he hadn't realized was still there. He breathed in. The forge was quiet behind him. The cottage was warm. The world, for a moment, felt like it fit in the space of a single breath. And when he returned inside and laid down once more, he didn't try to sleep. He only let it come. There were mornings now when Emmerich didn't light the forge right away. Not because he had no work, and not from weariness, but because the stillness before the fire felt more complete than ever. The kind of quiet that wasn't asking to be filled, but simply noticed. The stones held a soft chill. The air tasted faintly of dew and old wood, and the sun touched the ground with long, golden fingers that stretched like a yawn across the village. He would sit by the doorway, a cup of warm water resting in both hands, and simply listen. Sometimes the birds spoke, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them became a kind of rhythm on its own, and Emmerich, who had once shaped iron as though time was running from him, now moved like time had stopped to sit beside him. The sculpture by the door had begun to rust, just at the base, where the light rarely reached. A fine red dust clung to the edges, soft as pollen. He didn't wipe it away. Rust, after all, was not decay. It was memory, the way metal remembered air. He touched the curve of it now and then, his fingers leaving behind the faintest print. In the village, talk had shifted. The winter, though mild, had been long. Now with spring fully awake, there were murmurs of festivals, small ones, quiet ones, but celebrations nonetheless. No parades, no music, just gatherings under trees and shared bread on long tables. It was the kind of festivity that belonged more to the earth than to the people. Emmerich was not one for gatherings, but this year, when asked if he might attend, he did not say no. He worked lightly that week, shaping a few new hooks for the weaver's stand, sharpening a garden spade dulled by river stones, reforging a broken ladle handle. But his mind wandered, not far, just enough to notice things: the pattern of bird shadows on the forge floor, the curl of steam from his tea, the way his own breath sounded softer in the morning than at dusk. On the day of the gathering, he bathed early, scrubbed the soot from under his nails more carefully than usual, and wore the cloak his mother had once mended for him, deep brown wool, stitched at the shoulder where he had once caught it on a nail. He arrived after the others, stepping quietly between tree trunks and folding benches, nodding to those who greeted him with warmth, but no questions. The table was full of shared food: baked roots, stewed grains, small cheeses wrapped in herbs. Emmerich took only a little and found a place near the edge of the clearing, where the breeze carried the scent of damp moss and wood smoke. Era was already there, seated on a low stone, speaking softly to a child who clutched a string of wooden beads. She looked up when Emmerich sat down, but didn't speak, just smiled. And that was enough. As dusk settled, lanterns were lit and hung from branches above, swinging gently in the breeze. No music played, but voices rose like it, soft laughter threading through the night like a river through reeds. Children ran in slow circles, trailing ribbons behind them, their movements more like dance than play. Emmerich stayed longer than he expected. He watched, mostly, and listened. He found comfort not in words, but in the hush between them, in the shared presence of others who, like him, weren't searching for anything loud. When the stars began to rise and the gathering thinned, Era approached and placed a small stone in his hand. "For your shelf," she said simply. He looked down. The stone was pale gray, but when turned toward the light, shimmered with the faintest sheen of green, like sunlight trapped beneath water. "It's from the river bend," she said. "The current leaves them behind when it slows." He nodded, closed his fingers around it, and tucked it into his coat pocket. When he returned home, the fire had gone out. He didn't relight it. Instead, he opened the wooden box with the 5 vials. He chose the one marked with the feather. Era had said it was for clarity, for lightness, and let a single drop fall into the clay dish by the window. The scent rose slowly, faint, clean, like linen left to dry in a sunlit breeze. He sat by the window with the stone in one hand and let the night surround him. The wind moved through the trees, low and even. No urgency, no call to do anything but sit and breathe. And that's what he did. He didn't think about the sculpture, or the forge, or the village. He didn't wonder what tomorrow held, or where Tomas might be, or what he might make next. He simply existed, held by the same silence that cradled the stars. The mornings came earlier now. The first light crept over the hills before the birds had begun to sing, and Emmerich often found himself awake before the sky had fully changed color. He didn't rise quickly. He lay still for a time, listening to the stillness around him, the subtle stretch of silence before the world began to stir. The stone Era had given him sat on the windowsill now, just beside the small clay dish. In the morning light, it shimmered faintly, its greenish glint shifting like the surface of a stream. He didn't touch it often. He only looked, as one might look at something that reminded them of water, even when surrounded by stone. In the forge, the rhythm had settled into something deeper. He no longer shaped only what was needed. He shaped what came to mind, forms that echoed his thoughts, though he didn't always understand them. One piece was narrow, rising upward in a slow twist that reminded him of wind. Another curled in on itself, like a fern uncurling or a thought returning home. He didn't name them. He didn't plan them. He let the iron decide. Sometimes villagers came to look. They stood in the doorway, hesitant to enter, as though they were stepping into a place more sacred than it once had been. They didn't ask what the pieces were for. They didn't ask if they were for sale. They simply looked, and nodded, and left. One afternoon, while working on a shape that resembled the petal of a flower not yet known, he heard a familiar voice at the door, still working without drawings. He looked up. Tomas stood there, his cloak dusty, his beard a little longer than before. He carried no pack this time, just a small satchel and the look of someone who hadn't meant to stop, but couldn't help it. "I thought you'd gone east," Emmerich said softly. "I did," Tomas replied. "And then I turned back." Emmerich didn't smile, not fully, but the corners of his mouth lifted, and the weight in the room shifted like a stool set down gently on a wooden floor. Tomas stepped inside and looked around. "There are more shapes now. I've stopped calling them anything." Tomas walked over to the sculpture by the door, brushing a finger across the light dusting of rust. "I like this one. I didn't make it to be liked." Tomas chuckled, low and warm. No, but it's true anyway. They didn't speak much that evening. Tomas stayed in the spare cot, his satchel resting near the door. Emmerich brewed a weak tea and poured 2 cups. They drank in silence, outside. The stars gathered like kindling, and the trees moved in slow conversation. The next morning, Tomas didn't say how long he'd stay, and Emmerich didn't ask. He handed him a brush, and the two of them cleaned tools in the soft light of early day. The brushes made a gentle scraping sound, rhythmic and steady, almost like the sound of quills on parchment or the wind across thatched roofs. For several days, they worked like that. No plans, no orders, just the forge, the tools, the shapes that asked to be born. One morning, Tomas paused mid-task. Do you ever wish you'd gone? Gone where? Anywhere. Away, like I did. Emmerich didn't answer at first. Then, I did go. Just not the same way. Tomas nodded slowly, as if that made sense. And maybe it did. In the evenings, they sat outside the forge, not facing each other, but facing outward, toward the path, the trees, the horizon. They didn't always speak. Sometimes Emmerich would hold a cup of warm water with dried mint. Tomas would shape shavings of wood with a small knife, letting the curls fall to the earth. There was no urgency between them, just time, and breath, and silence. One day, a young woman from the village came with a request. Her mother had passed weeks earlier. She held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a simple necklace, the metal chain broken, one of the links bent out of shape. She wore this every day, the girl said. I don't need it to look new, just whole. Emmerich took it without a word and set it gently on the bench. He repaired it slowly that evening. The forge lit low, the metal warmed just enough to soften. He reshaped the link, filed the sharp edge smooth, and polished it only slightly, not to erase time, but to remind it had been seen. When the girl returned the next day, he handed it to her with both hands. She held it to her chest, eyes glistening but dry. Thank you, she said. It feels like her again. And then she was gone. Tomas had watched from the doorway. It's not just a forge anymore. It never was. That night, a storm passed through, not fierce, but steady. Rain tapping on the roof, wind brushing against the shutters. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and cooling iron. Emmerich and Tomas sat at the table, the wooden box of vials between them. Tomas reached for the one marked with the leaf. What's this one? For grounding, Emmerich said. Era made them. Tomas opened it, let a drop fall onto the sleeve of his tunic, and inhaled deeply. It smells like roots. It's meant to. They sat there in silence for a long while, the rain weaving patterns on the roof above them, the oil gently warming in the air, carrying with it something old and calming. When Emmerich rose to stoke the coals, Tomas looked at him and said, You know, when I left the first time, I thought I was running toward something. And now? Tomas shrugged. Now, think I was just learning how to come back. Emmerich didn't reply. He didn't need to. He returned to the fire, nudged a coal with the poker, and let the flame catch again. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside, the silence deepened, and the forge, as always, glowed soft and alive. Tomas stayed longer than either of them had planned, though no plan had ever been spoken. Each day began with the same quiet rituals: a warming of coals, the soft brushing of soot from metal, water boiled without a word, sips taken beside the open door. There was no need for schedules. The days moved on their own, shaped by light and weather and the weight of what did or did not arrive at the forge. Some mornings they worked side by side, one shaping while the other cooled, one filing edges while the other bent iron to match a curve no longer found in nature but still remembered by the hands. They didn't talk much, and when they did, it was in soft phrases, like two old rivers meeting, murmuring over smooth stones. One afternoon, a boy arrived, not the candlepan child, nor the horseshoe nephew, but a stranger to Emmerich. Thin arms, cautious eyes. He held out a piece of folded cloth, revealing a thin silver bracelet, snapped at one end. The metal splayed like a wound. It was my sister's, he said. She dropped it years ago. I found it under the floorboard. Emmerich took it in his palm, and examined the break. The metal was cold, but not brittle. A simple piece, worn by time and quiet grief. He nodded once, and the boy left without another word. Tomas turned the bracelet slowly in his hands later that night, letting the firelight catch the thin engraving on the inside. "It's older than it looks," he said. "Things usually are," Emmerich replied. "When they fixed it, they didn't reshape it entirely. They joined the two ends without polishing away the dent. A small line remained, not a flaw, just a memory. They left it on the workbench, knowing the boy would return. He did. 2 days later, he took it without speaking, held it to his chest, and walked away. Emmerich watched him go, then turned back toward the fire. Tomas never looked up from the blade he was sharpening. That evening, they walked through the field. Behind the forge, a place where the grass grew in uneven patches, and the trees thinned into soft bark saplings. The air was cooler, the kind that carried the scent of rain long before it arrived. Emmerich crouched near a stone where moss had begun to bloom in thick green cushions. He brushed a hand across it. "I used to think nothing grew here." Tomas stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes scanning the tree line. "You were looking for the wrong kind of growth." They walked in silence after that, the only sounds their steps and the low rustle of wind nudging the tall grass. On the edge of the clearing, they paused. Fireflies blinked once, then again, scattered like tiny lanterns in the growing dusk. Back in the forge, Emmerich began shaping a piece that had no purpose, no weight. It was hollow in the center, the edges curved like a bowl that had been turned inside out. He didn't know why he was making it. He only knew it wanted to exist. Tomas watched from the doorway, arms resting against the frame. "You don't make weapons anymore," he said softly. "I don't need to," Emmerich replied. Tomas nodded, then added, "I used to think I had to carry something sharp just to feel safe. And now, think I just needed to put it down." The fire crackled, sparks jumping in the dark like words never spoken. That night, Tomas took out a small bundle from his satchel wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with a string. Inside was a knife, old, but clean. The handle worn smooth, the blade chipped at the edge. "I carried this across 3 winters," he said. Emmerich looked at it for a long time before speaking. "Then bury it," he said. "If it's done with you." Tomas stared into the fire. Then, slowly, he nodded. At dawn, they walked to the grove behind the cottage, the same spot where the moss grew thickest. Tomas knelt, placed the blade into the earth, and covered it without ceremony. No words were said. No farewell was needed. The soil accepted it, as it accepted all things, quietly, patiently, completely. That evening, the forge felt lighter. The fire rose without struggle. The coals held their heat longer than usual. Emmerich shaped a small spiral, not for anyone, not for anything, and set it beside the flame to cool. He didn't speak of it, neither did Tomas. They sat, side by side, drinking water from tin cups, and watched the last light fade behind the hills. No stars yet, just the long breath of twilight, like the world settling into itself. Emmerich leaned back, eyes half closed. "You think you'll go again?" he asked. Tomas took a slow breath. "Maybe, but not to escape, just to walk." Emmerich nodded. "You'll always have a place here, when your feet need stillness." Tomas didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet smile, "This place gave me back my silence." And with that, the night took them in. The fire lowered itself. The forge fell into breath, and the world, for another night, was whole. The mornings had taken on a softness that felt earned. Not the softness of sleep, but of presence, the kind that came from knowing what mattered, and more importantly, what didn't. The forge no longer marked the day. The birds did. The way the mist lifted. The sound of Tomas's boots brushing the earth as he walked the outer path near the edge of the woods. Tomas had not said if he would stay or leave, and Emmerich had not asked. Their silence was not heavy, it was shared, like a blanket passed between them in the cold. They didn't need to speak to understand one another now. Something between them had aligned. Not perfectly, but peacefully. One morning, Emmerich found a folded piece of parchment on the workbench. Tomas's handwriting quiet, slanted, the ink light from a dry quill. Going to the ridge. Back by dusk. Don't stoke the fire too hot today. The metal breathes better when it's slow. Emmerich smiled faintly and tucked the note into the hollow of the window where he kept odds and ends, dried leaves, a carved button, a stone that had once looked like an egg. He worked that day with a kind of still joy. Not the kind that burned, but the kind that hung. He repaired a rake, smoothed the bend in a door bracket, shaped a curve into a strip of brass, just to see if it would hold its bend without protest. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like water between reeds. By late afternoon, Tomas returned, his boots dusted, his hair tousled by wind. He carried nothing, but his face looked clearer, as though something had been left behind on the ridge. They didn't speak of it. Emmerich poured water. Tomas sat. That was enough. Later that week, the widow Marlin returned, though not for anything broken. She brought with her a faded box, wooden, chipped, worn soft at the corners. Inside it, nestled on a strip of cloth, was a collection of small iron keys. I don't know what doors they ever opened, she said, but I'd like to keep them from rusting away. Can you give them purpose again? Emmerich turned them in his hands. Each key was slightly different, one long and thin, another square-toothed, another curved like a question mark. They were cold, but they had weight. History, memory. I'll try, he said. That evening, he and Tomas sat at the workbench, the keys lined up like tiny stories waiting to be told. You could shape them into wind chimes, Tomas suggested. Too light. A sculpture? Maybe. They didn't decide that night. Instead, they began experimenting. Tomas held one key to the forge's glow, watching the way light touched the metal. Emmerich tried linking two together with a fine loop of wire. By moonrise, they had shaped the beginnings of something, not art. Not exactly, but a kind of quiet language, a constellation of moments made tangible. They mounted the finished piece, a ring of linked keys hanging from a curved beam of copper near the forge's door. When the wind moved through the space just right, the keys clicked softly against each other, like the ticking of an old clock that had forgotten how to keep time. Marlin returned days later and stood listening for a long while. They sound like my husband's watch used to, she said. Thank you. Then she walked away, and the keys kept speaking. The days flowed on. Tomas began walking more, not to leave, just to move. He brought back leaves, sometimes feathers, once a small stone, with a hole worn perfectly through its center. For the window, he said, handing it over without further comment. Emmerich hung it with a bit of twine, and when the sun hit it at a certain angle, it cast a narrow beam across the forge, straight and warm. One evening, a small group of villagers arrived, at once the baker, the weaver, and the teacher. They carried nothing broken. They only came to talk, not loudly, not long. They sat near the forge entrance, warming their hands, sipping water. Emmerich offered no tea, no explanations, and yet they stayed. They didn't speak of the past, or grief, or need. They spoke of the way the crows had nested early this year, of the strange shape of a cloud 2 days before, of a child who had begun to hum in her sleep. The kind of talk that held no urgency, the kind that filled a room without weighing it down. When they left, Emmerich turned to Tomas and said, "It feels different now." Tomas nodded. "It's not a forge anymore. It's a hearth." And Emmerich, who had never thought of that word as his, suddenly found it fit. Like a worn glove, like an old path made smooth by quiet steps. That night, as sleep approached, Emmerich didn't reach for the book on the shelf, or the vial of oil, or the copper spiral. He simply lay still, listening to the wind, to the soft clicks of the keys, to the silence within the walls, and sleep came like it always had, slowly, completely, without asking permission. The rains returned softly this year, not in floods, not in storms, but as a steady, thoughtful rhythm, the kind that whispered against the roof, crept gently down the stones, and left the air thick with memory. Emmerich didn't cover the forge's windows this time. He let the rain in, not the water itself, but the sound of it, the hush of it, like distant drums beating slow beneath the earth. Tomas had begun rising earlier than Emmerich now. He would leave quietly, just before the first light, walking the path between the forge and the woods. Sometimes he returned with little more than silence. Other times, he brought seeds, damp with soil. Once, he returned carrying a small clay cup not made by him, not new. Found, perhaps, left behind by someone else. Emmerich placed it near the anvil, where the copper spiral sat. The forge no longer felt like a place of labor. It had become something else. A place where things came not to be built, but to become. One morning, as the rain slowed and the light grew gold at the edges, Emmerich opened the window fully and let the scent of wet earth flood the room. The keys by the door sang softly in the breeze. The air felt different, not lighter, just open. He sat for a long while before touching any tools. When he did begin, it was to shape a piece of metal no longer than his palm. He didn't know what it would be, not even as he bent it, shaped it, pressed soft ridges into its curve. It looked like a wave, or perhaps a petal, or a flame. It didn't need a name. That afternoon, a stranger arrived, not a traveler, not a villager, someone in between. She stood at the doorway, her cloak damp, eyes bright and quiet. In her hands, she held a carved wooden flute broken at the mouthpiece, the grain cracked. "Can you fix music?" she asked. Emmerich took the flute, turned it slowly in his hands, and studied the break. "I can try," he said. She nodded once and left. Thomas returned from his walk just as Emmerich was sanding the first layer of wood, gently removing the splinters, smoothing the curve without changing its shape. "A musician?" Thomas asked. "May," Emmerich replied. "Maybe just someone who remembers sound." Together, they worked into the evening, shaping a thin inlay of copper to strengthen the mouthpiece from within. They didn't change the flute song. They only made it whole again. When the woman returned, she didn't speak. She took the flute, pressed it to her lips, and played a single note. Soft, low, carried like a thread on the breeze. She smiled, nodded, and disappeared back down the path. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, turning a thin reed between his fingers. "There's music in everything, if you're listening." "I'm learning how," Emmerich said. The days after were slow, from lack of work, but from fullness. The kind of full that doesn't crowd, only expands. Villagers came not just with broken things, but with stories. They left behind jars of jam, scraps of cloth, sketches, bits of string. The forge shelves began to fill not with tools, but with offerings, symbols of time shared, moments remembered. One child brought a drawing the forge, drawn in green crayon, with the sun rising behind it and tiny birds perched on the roof. Emmerich placed it near the window, and the paper fluttered each time the breeze moved through. Even the animals came. Now a stray cat, pale and lean, took to sleeping near the coals when the forge cooled at night. It never asked for food, just warmth. Presents. Thomas built a perch by the doorway from driftwood, and some days a hawk sat there, still and watching. Neither guest disrupted the other. All belonged. One afternoon, the teacher returned this time not for conversation, but with a question. "We've begun writing about places that hold memory," she said. "The children are choosing trees, rivers, kitchens. One chose a shadow on the wall. Would you come speak to them? Not to teach, just to sit." Emmerich hesitated. "I don't speak like you do," he said. "You don't need to," she replied. "They only want presents," he agreed. He went the next day, carrying nothing. He sat in a circle of small wooden chairs, surrounded by eyes too curious to be polite. He didn't tell a story. He only answered their questions. One child asked what fire felt like a breath that never ends, he said. Another asked why iron bends. "Because it listens," he said. And when a small voice asked why people break, Emmerich answered, "So they know what mending feels like." There was silence after that. Not awkward, not heavy, just the kind that arrives when truth has been spoken too softly to echo. He left a small copper coil on their windowsill before walking back. No one saw him place it, but the teacher found it later and smiled. That evening, Thomas made bread. He wasn't a baker, but he worked slowly, kneading with care, shaping loaves that cracked just slightly at the top as they baked. The forge smelled like earth and grain and home. They ate in silence, and the fire, once the heart of labor, now burned like a candle, soft, warm, and still. The nights had begun to stretch just a little longer, not with cold, but with a hush, the kind that settles into corners and softens even the loudest thoughts. Emmerich noticed the stars more now, not just for how they looked, but for how they returned each night without fail. Their rhythm matched his own, quiet and consistent. The forge, too, had begun to glow more gently. He didn't feed it as fiercely anymore. Instead, he let it burn slow, as though it had learned patience from the silence that now lived within its walls. When he walked in, it felt less like a place to make things, and more like a place to remember. Tomas had begun carving again, not for anyone, not to sell, but to feel the grain of wood beneath his thumb. He shaped animals mostly, birds with outstretched wings, small deer curled in rest, fish caught mid-turn as if swimming through air. They weren't perfect, some were lopsided, a few chipped at the base, but they held something that perfection couldn't carry: presence. One morning, Emmerich found a bird carved from driftwood perched above the forge shelf. He didn't ask who put it there, he only touched its wingtip and nodded. A soft kind of beauty had begun to settle over everything. Not beauty that shouted, but one that hummed in the way iron cooled, or in the way Tomas stirred tea without looking, or in the way the cat curled tighter when the wind whispered at night. Era returned one evening, just as dusk settled its full weight across the valley. She stepped into the forge with her hands tucked into her sleeves, eyes as calm as ever. She didn't come to ask, she came to give. "I found something," she said, pulling a strip of cloth from her satchel. Inside was a small bell no bigger than a walnut, dark with age, but still whole. "It came from the old chapel," she said. "They used to ring it at dusk, for peace, before the wars." Emmerich turned it over in his palm. It was heavier than it looked, not from weight, but from memory. "Would you hang it?" she asked. He nodded. Tomas affixed a small hook above the doorframe. Emmerich hung the bell from it with a loop of twine. It didn't chime that night, or the next, but it moved when the wind did, not with sound, but with presence. That was enough. The forge now held sound in many forms. The bell above the door, the keys still brushing against one another near the wall, Tomas humming under his breath. Era, when she visited, would grind herbs in the stone bowl, each rotation like a small echo of the world outside. Emmerich didn't try to control these sounds. He let them live, let them fill the spaces between work and thought. One evening, he sat alone with a piece of steel that refused to bend the way he imagined. He didn't force it. He turned it gently, softened it again, and waited. The piece didn't obey, it adapted, became something else, a curve he hadn't meant, but one that made more sense the longer he looked at it. He smiled softly. Sometimes, the metal knew better. That night, Tomas placed another carving on the windowsill, a fox this time, with a lifted paw and half-closed eyes. Emmerich touched its back and placed a small pebble beside it. Neither explained the gesture. The next day, a child arrived with a cracked mug. "It's not worth much," she said. "But it was mine." Emmerich examined it. The break was clean, a neat line, like a breath held too long. "I can't make it new," he said. "I don't need it new," she replied. "Just together." He mended it with a fine seam of silver, not to hide the break, but to honor it. When she held it again, her fingers traced the line, and she smiled. "I like it better this way," she whispered, then turned and ran back down the hill. Later, Emmerich stared at the leftover silver thread. He thought of all the things in his life that had cracked and how none of them had truly broken. They had just changed shape, shifted. One evening, Tomas sat near the fire, shaping a wooden box with no lid. "Storage?" Emmerich asked. "No," Tomas replied. "A space. For what?" "For whatever someone needs to put down." The box remained near the door, unused for days. Then, slowly, it began to fill. A scrap of fabric, a feather, a ribbon, a stone with the word scratched faintly into it. Still. No one claimed the items. No one explained them. They just arrived. The forge had become more than a place. It was becoming a pause, a breath between days, a place not to speak, but to listen, not to work, but to rest. And so Emmerich shaped less, mended more, sat longer, slept deeper, and the fire, steady as ever, whispered its slow song across the walls, a lullaby of warmth and time and silence well earned. The mornings were quieter now, even for Emmerich. The kind of quiet that didn't wait for a sound, didn't need a reason to exist. It simply was like the mist that clung to the hills or the way the first bird took longer to sing. He would rise slowly, stretch his back by the window, and look not at the sky, but at the ground where the earth carried its own kind of voice, soft and sure. The forge still stood as it always had, stone and smoke, warmth and shadow. But something inside it had changed, or perhaps it had finally returned to what it had always meant to be, a place for what remained after everything else had been stripped away. Tomas was out more often now, not far, just walking. He never said where he went. Sometimes he returned with a story, sometimes just a smudge of dirt on his palms, and the kind of silence that meant he'd seen something that didn't want to be spoken. One morning, Emmerich found the clay cup cracked, the one they had placed beside the anvil. Not a sharp break, but a slow one, the kind that appeared without cause. He held it in his hands and didn't fix it. He set it gently in the box without a lid, the one Tomas had carved, and the crack faced upward, like a wound that didn't mind being seen. That day, he made nothing. He didn't touch iron, or light the coals, or pour the water. Instead, he sat, just sat, and listened. The sounds were all still there, the wind, the occasional shifting of the cat, the way the bell above the door trembled without chiming. But there was something else beneath it now, a stillness so deep it didn't feel empty. Later, Tomas returned with a single branch of pine, fresh and green, and laid it on the bench. Smelled like winter up there, he said, brushing the dust from his coat. Emmerich nodded. Maybe it's coming early. I don't mind, Tomas said. Some things are better in the cold. They didn't need to say more. The next few days passed like a single breath, long, slow, seamless. Emmerich repaired a buckle for the weaver, burnished a copper bowl for the baker, filed the edge of an old gardening trowel for the teacher. None of the villagers stayed long. They came softly, waited without knocking, and left small bundles in return: jam, cloth, dried lavender. Era returned again, not with oil this time, but with a question. There's a child, she said. Quiet, more quiet than most. He doesn't speak much, but he watches everything. His parents say he wanders in the woods, touches bark, listens to tree roots. Would it be all right if he spent time here? Not to learn, just to sit. Emmerich thought for a long time, then nodded once. Bring him when the light is soft, he said. And so the boy came, not with words, but with wide eyes and small hands. He sat near the coals and didn't flinch when they hissed. He touched the stone walls gently, traced the line of the copper spiral with his fingertip, and once, without asking, placed a pebble in the wooden box with no lid. Tomas smiled when he saw it. He knows. He doesn't need to be taught, Emmerich said, just held. Each day, the boy stayed a little longer. He didn't speak, he didn't ask, but he watched with the kind of attention that softened even the iron. He seemed to understand the shape of things, the way warmth moved, the way metal softened, the way silence carried more than sound. On the fourth day, he handed Emmerich a twig, smooth, slightly curved, with one end charred black. For you, he said. Only those 2 words. Emmerich held the twig and nodded. Thank you. And then the boy was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his stillness. That night, Emmerich didn't work. He sat beside the forge and let the glow rest on his skin. Tomas brought bread. They ate in silence. And after, as the moon rose behind the ridge, they stepped outside. The air had a crisp edge, the kind that warned of frost. I think it's almost time, Tomas said. For what? For the quiet to deepen. Emmerich didn't answer. He only closed his eyes and listened to the rustling trees, to the bell that didn't ring, to the weight of peace settling across the world like a thick wool cloak. Inside the forge, the cat stretched and curled again. The wind moved through the keys, the bell trembled, and Emmerich, without knowing why, placed the boy's twig beside the clay cup in the open box, not to forget, but to remember gently. The first frost came quietly. In the early morning, painting the grass with a soft white breath. It didn't crackle or bite, it settled, like a memory, not yet cold enough to freeze, but enough to remind you that warmth is never promised. Emmerich stepped outside barefoot, letting the chill find his skin. He didn't pull away. He simply stood, watching his breath rise like a spirit. In the still air, inside, the forge held onto its warmth, but even that felt different now. The heat didn't radiate in the same fierce way. It pulsed instead, slow and even, as if the fire had learned to rest too. Thomas stirred a pot of root soup, humming softly, not a tune but a rhythm, one that matched the long draw of the wind against the walls. He didn't speak, neither did Emmerich. There was no need. Everything between them was already known. By midday, the boy returned, the quiet one. He stood in the doorway longer than usual, his hands deep in his sleeves. He didn't step forward, until Emmerich turned slightly and gave the faintest nod. This time, he brought something with him, a string, frayed at the ends, with a round stone tied in the center. He didn't explain it. He placed it in the wooden box beside the twig and the cup. Then he sat, cross-legged, still. Thomas handed him a wooden carving, a bird in flight, and the boy turned it over in his hands, like it held a story only he could hear. He didn't speak, but he smiled faintly. It was enough. The fire in the forge burned low that day, not for lack of fuel, but because neither of them stoked it beyond what it offered freely. Emmerich sharpened an old scythe head. Thomas smoothed the edges of a wooden bowl. The boy watched every movement, but not as a student, as if he were witnessing something return to life. When dusk came, the wind shifted, not strong or just deep, or like a slow inhale. The bell above the door gave a single, faint chime, just one. It was the first time it had rung. No one reacted aloud, but all of them heard it. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, his carving knife resting in his lap. Emmerich placed a piece of thick cloth over the coals to release a scent cedar and something else, something warm. The boy had gone, but the air he left behind was still full of presence. I think he's listening to something we can't hear, Thomas said at last. Emmerich nodded. Or maybe remembering something we've forgotten. They sat in silence after that, not out of weariness, but reverence, the kind of stillness that holds space for things older than language. Later that week, the teacher arrived once more, this time not to speak. She brought a book, thin, handwritten, bound with twine, and placed it on the bench. The children made it, she said. Each wrote a sentence about the forge. Emmerich untied it gently and read in silence. Some lines were crooked, some words spelled with the earnest guesswork of young minds. It smells like warm rock. I think the fire has a secret, I heard. A sound here didn't want to tell anyone about, but it made me sleep better. He closed the book and handed it back with both hands. Tell them I heard every word. The teacher smiled and left without another word. That night, Emmerich shaped a small medallion from bronze, not ornate, not polished, just a circle, pressed with a single curved line that could have been a river, or a flame, or a path. He placed it in the open box. It didn't need to be taken. It only needed to exist. The days that followed grew shorter. The sun never quite climbed as high. Shadows lengthened, even at noon. But the forge never felt dim. It held its own kind of light now, and the visitors continued. A woman brought a broken brooch from her grandmother. A man came with a question about a windmill gear. A boy, not the quiet one, a different one, brought a paper boat he asked to be turned into metal. Emmerich didn't laugh. He shaped a thin piece of tin, folded like a boat, and handed it back. The boy stared at it like it was treasure. The forge had become many things, a place of work, of rest, of silence, of story. But most of all, it had become held, not by hands, by time, by presence, by the small but steady truth that some places didn't need to be loud to be full. That evening, Thomas placed a carving of a tree near the bell. Its branches were uneven. One leaned slightly, as if tired. Emmerich traced its trunk with a finger, then walked outside. The stars had returned. Clear, scattered, ancient. He stood beneath them, and for the first time in many months, he whispered something aloud, not to anyone, not even to the stars themselves. Just a sound, a wordless breath, and then he went back inside. The bell did not chime again that night, but something in the air shifted, and the silence deepened. The air had changed again, not cold, not heavier, but clearer, as if the season had drawn a long, deep breath. Emmerich noticed it in the way the leaves no longer rustled but settled, the way the sky no longer chased the sun but held it softly. Like a memory too precious to let go, the forge still held its quiet warmth, but even that felt final, somehow. Not as an end, but as a resting point. A place where everything that needed to be said had already been said, not through words, but through the quiet rhythm of hands and breath and time. Tomas carved less now. His pieces remained unfinished, resting on shelves, as though they were still deciding what they wanted to become. He spent most of his time sitting, watching, tracing the grains in the wood with his fingertips, like reading a language only the trees remembered. One morning, Emmerich lit the forge without needing to. There was no metal to shape, no repair to be done. But the fire rose, anyway, not out of habit, but out of reverence. It crackled softly, like a whispered story retold for the thousandth time. A memory shared not for understanding, but for presence. The boy returned to the quiet one, now a regular shadow in the forge, moving without sound, touching things gently, never disturbing. He brought nothing this time. No pebble, no twig, no object for the open box. Instead, he sat beside the flame and, after a long while, reached into his pocket and placed something in Emmerich's hand. A shell, a perfect, chipped at the edge, but smooth and pale, with a spiral so fine it looked etched by thought itself. Emmerich said nothing. He placed it in the open box, next to the clay cup and the carved fox and the medallion. Later, Tomas stood before the forge, looking into the coals. "I think it's almost time," he said. "For what?" Emmerich asked softly. "For the quiet to settle." It was a phrase Emmerich had heard before, but this time, it felt different, as though it was not about the forge, or the fire, or even them, but about everything. A closing breath before a long exhale. That evening, they closed the forge doors earlier than usual. They didn't latch them, just leaned them gently so the air could still move through. Emmerich walked outside alone. The stars had already claimed the sky. Bright, patient, old. He stood beneath them and let the night fold around him, soft and full. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of water, a stream maybe, or the memory of one. It had been years since he'd walked down the old ridge path, the one that led beyond the forge's reach. He thought, perhaps, tomorrow he might go there again, not to find anything, just to listen. The wind picked up slightly, and the bell above the door gave a soft chime just once. A single note, not loud, not clear, but enough. Inside, the fire lowered itself, as if bowing to something older than flame. Tomas had left a new carving on the windowsill, a hand, open, palm up, empty, but inviting. Emmerich stood before it for a long while. Then, slowly, he added to the wooden box beside the door a sliver of charcoal, taken from the very edge of the coals. Blackened, used, but not gone. The boy watched from across the room and nodded, and Emmerich understood. Nothing here was ever wasted. Not silence, not fire, not even time, just change, shifted, held. The final snow didn't fall with drama. It came like sleep, slow, soft, inevitable. By morning, the roof of the forge was dusted in white, the stone steps slick with frost. The bell above the door was silent again, but the hush around it was thick, as if sound had wrapped itself in a blanket. Inside, Emmerich stood before the embers. He didn't add wood, didn't stir them. He only watched as the last of the red softened to gray, the way breath fades from a window pane. Tomas sat nearby, a mug of water in his hands, steam barely rising. His eyes were fixed not on the fire, but on the door, open just slightly, letting in the cold. They hadn't spoken much in recent days. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said, or felt, or understood. The boy had not returned, not for 3 days, but neither man seemed worried. Some silences weren't absence, they were space. And then, As afternoon softened into that gold hush that only winter brings, the door creaked open. Not wide, not sudden, just enough. The boy stepped in, cheeks red from wind, and walked directly to the wooden box. He looked inside, then removed the twig, and the cup, and the shell, and the sliver of charcoal, one by one. He laid them on the ground in front of the fire, a gentle circle. He didn't speak, didn't look up. Then he stepped back. Emmerich, without knowing why, knelt and placed the copper medallion at the center. Tomas, wordlessly, added the wooden hand, open and upward. They stood, the three of them, around that quiet circle of remnants, each piece once broken, forgotten, discarded, now held again, together. No ceremony followed, no words, just the sound of breath and the wind and the settling of something unspoken. The boy looked at Emmerich, then Tomas, then turned and left, not rushed, not hesitant, just done. The door didn't close behind him. It remained ajar, swaying gently in the breeze like a curtain in a tired house. That night, Tomas packed his few belongings: a knife, a worn scarf, a pouch of dried herbs. Emmerich didn't ask. He didn't need to. I'm going to follow the river, Tomas said softly, tying the scarf at his waist. Emmerich nodded. Will you come back? Tomas paused. Maybe, maybe not, but I'll remember. That was enough. At dawn, Tomas stepped out into the white light, snow crunching beneath his boots. He turned once. Emmerich raised a hand, and then he was gone. The forge was still warm, still whole, but still. Emmerich didn't feel alone. He moved slowly, folding cloths, setting tools in place. He dusted the windowsill where the carvings rested, straightened the small fox, turned the carved hand so the fingers faced the light. He lit one final coal in the forge, not to work, but to keep memory warm. The flame caught easily. It always had. Then he sat, not to wait, not to rest, just to be. And the silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full of every sound that had passed through this space, every story, every breath, every small offering placed gently into the box that never needed a lid. Outside, the snow fell again, soft as ash. Inside, the fire hummed, and Emmerich closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because the day had ended. And some endings are not endings at all. They are simply the last word in a story that continues quietly, gently in the silence that follows.